You want to know how to avoid getting a medical board complaint? And did you know that 80% of medical board complaints really just come down to about three main concepts? Hi, I'm attorney David Holt. I run a healthcare law firm where we only deal with healthcare businesses, and often I'll see medical board complaints, and really they fall into three very preventable categories. Number one is going to be poor communication with patients. Number two is going to be record keeping and documentation. And number three is going to be generally adhering to professional standards. Those are the three that I'm going to go over in this video. Let's start with number one. Number one is poor communication with patients. So unfortunately in healthcare, a very low expectation has been set. So the bar is very low for what communication with patients is considered as a normal level, right? So what I say to a small healthcare business who doesn't benefit from being a massive hospital system that has an intake system and a receptionist and people, monitoring the phones and communications around the clock, is break it down into, it's always who, what, where, when, why. Where doesn't really apply, but let's start with who. So who is it that the patient's going to be working with and communicating? With a small business, usually it's just a one-person show, but when we get into a situation where we're dealing with multiple levels of practitioners, the patient needs to know who they're working with at what point in the journey. So it may start with a physician, MD, nurse practitioner, but later in the process, you might only be interacting with a medical assistant or a registered nurse, right? So making very clear to the patient who they're supposed to be working with and communicating with. Number one, what? So the what form of the communication is going to come down to what it is that you do, and especially what it is that you do not do. So this should be highlighted in an informed consent form. That's a fantastic spot to say what you do and what you don't do. But absent that, as we're moving along in the patient journey and they're getting procedures, they're moving along with their treatment plan, we need to make it very clear, and it's going to play into the next point later. We need to make very clear as to what you do and especially what you don't do. And here's why that's important and where this leads to a medical board complaint. If you don't clarify what you don't do, right, that could be considered an omission. So if I'm a primary care physician, the general assumption is that I have a general purview over most things that the patient brings before me, and the expectation is that I would either treat them or I would get a referral. Right? So the things that you don't do, you still want to identify them as an issue and then make sure that a referral or that the patient is communicated to that you will not be handling that. Simple medical board complaints and medical malpractice prevention would be document that and make it clear that that's back on the patient now to figure that out. When? So when really plays more to timeline when we're talking about patient communication. And so when does the patient expect to be communicated with? When is the next time that they're going to hear from you as the medical doctor? I see way too many medical board complaints and they're usually dismissed, but it's still an annoyance and it can be part of a more chronic pattern and then actually lead to official disciplinary action when a patient is not communicated with during their patient journey. And so I know that it's tough. I know that as a doctor, you are working day to day on all the patient files, and some things can fall through the cracks and you meant to get to a patient communication, or you're waiting on a lab, or you're waiting on somebody else to do something. The patient doesn't know that. All they know is they came in for the visit, they have this issue, the issue's still not resolved, and they don't know how long they're supposed to wait. Is it a day? Is it weeks? Is it months? Are they supposed to be going somewhere else or doing something, seeing another provider? So the when, and this can very easily be broken down into a nice little system for the patient journey where you chart out every little touch point and every little communication, and even make use of automated communications, will allow the patient to know when they should expect the next communication. Now, the patient may not be thrilled with how long that timeline is. They may not be thrilled with how frequently they're being communicated with, but that's really more of a them issue than a you issue, and it's not something that would invite a disciplinary action unless you've chosen to only provide these massive intervals, unreasonable 3-month or something communication intervals. So that's going to be the when. How to communicate with you. This is going to play a little bit more to professional standards later in the third point, but how to communicate you, poor patient communication. If you want them to use an EHR, so some sort of a HIPAA compliant, system in order to communicate with you, that needs to be communicated to them. You want them to call and you're okay with that. That needs to be made clear to them. If email is okay, all of those forms are okay as long as we alert the patients how it is that you want to be communicated with. Where this comes into play is, you have a perfectly good system, but a patient continues to call the front desk, day after day, and it just somehow makes its way, or they're leaving voicemails or they're sending emails that aren't being responded to because that's not your normal system for doing a lab result test communication or some sort of medical record follow-up. And then it gets elevated to they're trying to get your attention by filing a medical board complaint or by going to social media or somewhere else, which invites other issues. And so that's where the how comes into play. Finally, in terms of patient communication, higher level, but it plays in well with the whole medical board and the rules and the ethics would be, why are we doing what we're doing? In a perfect world, every patient would read the informed consent form, but as an attorney, I can tell you that's not the case. In fact, if I had to just guess as to how many people actually read a medical informed consent form all the way from start to finish, I would estimate it's probably around 1%, maybe in the 1 to 5% range. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but it's just what I would see from observation. So what that means is the patient may not know exactly why you're choosing the path that you are for them in the patient treatment plan. And so it's very important that you communicate why we're doing this test, why we're doing this treatment, why we're taking the course of action that we are, so that hindsight's 2020 when you're looking back at treatment and something didn't work or it was the wrong course or we should have done that test. And so communicating very clearly and effectively along the way why we're doing what we're doing, and to get to my second point here shortly, documenting that is going to protect you against a medical board. So let's jump into number 2. So we just talked about number 1, communication, right? Good communication. Poor communication can lead to a medical board complaint. Now also poor record keeping and documentation can also lead to a medical board complaint. And if you do get a medical board complaint, good record keeping and documentation can save you when you're giving that first response, or if we're getting into a hearing situation or producing records. Having that documentation, especially to the previous point of having the communications with the patient clearly documented, that is going to allow the medical board to have something to go off of, to piece together a nice timeline of events and what happened, facts, and then say, okay, this is reasonable, this complaint can be dismissed. Now, without that, of course, you as the doctor may know exactly what happened, right? It's just that you didn't notate it in the record. You may remember this patient vividly. In fact, they may have been a thorn in your side from the very beginning, but you made the mistake of not actually documenting all of the communications with them along the way. So what you need to do when we're talking about record keeping is, I am a fan of over documenting rather than under documenting. It's easy to say as an attorney, but I think it should be the same for a doctor or medical professional. We should be documenting not only the patient intake, but why we're taking significant courses of action in the treatment plan, and then in progress notes, whatever you can do to make the standard that I say, if we're trying to just really dumb this down and simplify it, is if I am another medical professional and I have zero experience with what you're doing, which when they're sitting over at the medical board and they're a volunteer or they are evaluating these complaints, they may not have much experience in your practice area. If they picked up your documentation and looked at it, would they be able to piece together what it is that happened? If they can't do that, you are below a reasonable standard. That's the standard that I would like to see your record keeping at. Everything above that is a bonus, right? If you're doing it in a fancy EHR and you have diagrams and pictures and everything's nice and automated, fantastic. That'd be the scenario. But that's not the case. Things are moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and you're going into patient visit after patient visit. Things get a little bit mixed up. I think what's especially important, and another area where I'll see patients be successful in a medical board complaint just due to poor record keeping, is documenting these we'll just say, more problematic patients that dissent, so they disagree with the course of treatment, or it seems like they just aren't understanding or hearing you when you say why we're doing something. Those are especially important to document in the medical record, because we don't want later in the process, 3 months later after we've forgotten about the plan, for the patient who's using, hindsight's 2020, they're looking back at their treatment plan, something went wrong, and now they blame you. And you certainly went through with them as to pros and cons and why we're doing something. They may have disagreed with it, but they still went along with it, informed consent. Not every course of action needs to be perfect, but we need to be informed in our decision making. So and we need to consent to do so voluntarily. Maybe they don't want to move forward. And so in that case, we actually document a refusal of medical treatment. So you suggested that we take this course of action, take this drug, treat this disease. They said, no, I want to use an alternative healing modality. You respect that, but you document that, because that dissent or that refusal of treatment should not be used against you if you presented them with that option. That finishes number 2, record keeping and documentation. Finally, I'm just going to get to a broader subject. Number 3 is going to be adhering to professional standards. This takes a few little subcategories, and I'll take one at a time. So number 1 is going to be breaking confidentiality, right? HIPAA, whatever Health Records Act of the respective states. It just needs to stay confidential, period. And staff need to be trained. So you're a medical practice, you're an owner, operator, you're in charge of all of your staff and all of the breaches that can result. And what that means is good software, good internal systems, and good ways to handle medical record requests. Sometimes when we're dealing in a physical facility, right, and you're moving in and out of treatment rooms and there's kind of joint common areas, even though we're behind a private door, we just need to be very careful with our protocols as to how we are moving patients around and how much they're in earshot of each other. So most care nowadays, though, is going to be telehealth. And telehealth is great, but some practitioners are getting a little loose on their confidentiality. So if you're taking healthcare visits via telehealth from home, we can't have your partner or your friend or whoever walking into the room or overhearing in the other room, or if you're driving in your car or whatever you're doing, you still need to be in a confidential space in your room, period, right? Yes, I suppose there are rare exceptions that you could carve out for patients, but I mean, just because it's telehealth and we're not in the same room as each other doesn't mean the confidentiality is just completely thrown out the window. So that's what I'll say on confidentiality. Also, related to that, we need to train staff, and you should know this as a medical professional, to not gossip and go out after work and say, DJ has this going on and I never would have guessed, and we did this treatment plan, but then he wanted to do some alternative treatment, what was he thinking? Absolutely none of that. There are ways that you can vent or have collaborative care conferences with other medical professionals, which is kind of a light therapy, I would say, for medical professionals as a way to collaboratively come to solutions for healthcare outcomes for patients. But you going back to your home, telling your friends, or going out to a restaurant, dinner party, what have you, and talking about a patient, even if it's in very broad terms, when we're dealing with celebrities or more recognizable patient outcomes, then those people could potentially be identified, even if you're not using their name or their age and all of that. So that's that. Number 2, and when we're talking about professional standards, just don't date patients. Please don't. Just assume that there aren't any exceptions. There really shouldn't be. There's plenty of fish in the sea. Just do not. I felt terrible for some medical board complaints related to doctors where the patient is aggressively pursuing the doctor, and the doctor is rejecting all of the advances, and then they slowly start dating the patient. Just don't do it. It nearly always leads to issues in a medical board complaint, and you're effectively powerless. You're a licensed professional by default. Similar to attorneys, there is a power dynamic between you and the patient, and live under the assumption that due to that power dynamic, a patient is not an option to be dated. And it's not just dating. Also, there could be bedside banter, or just banter, any sort of flirting, off-color comments, any of that. Communication needs to be professional. Even if the patient starts inviting some banter, some swearing, off-colored remarks, whatever, flirting, keep it professional. You are setting the bar, not the patient. Substance use and alcohol. It runs all of the professional. Attorneys especially can empathize, dentists as well, but medical doctors, keep an eye on substance and alcohol use, period. I mean, it's a medical board complaint can come really from any angle, right? Because that doesn't just have to be from patients. That can be from anyone in the community saying, hey, I saw Dr. So-and-so, looks like they were pretty lit up at this event, and I'm concerned about their ability to then turn around and go do surgeries the next day. There's no way he could have been sober when he went in. Okay, now your alcohol and substance use is under scrutiny. So keep an eye on that. There are plenty of support groups out there, and that's all I'll say on that. Finally, and this one is getting, things are moving fast, right? 2024, you need to stay up to date on current treatments and alternatives. And so in a lot of areas, we are moving at a very rapid pace for new drugs, new treatments, modalities, new combinations of treatments, right? It's not just pharmaceutical based, there's also lifestyle and perhaps other things that we can weave into the treatment plan. You need to stay up to date on that. Here's why, and here's how a medical board will play out, right? Is there was a drug that came to market, there was another treatment modality that was never even mentioned to the patient. You didn't even know about it because you kind of just been doing the same thing, running it a little bit more like a business, one trick pony. Turns out that patient has an adverse health event years after they had met with you, and they go and argue, both for malpractice and the medical board, that it was an unreasonable standard of care for you to not have suggested that modality. So that's going to be the last one there. I hope this was helpful. Please subscribe, like, and follow if you'd like more content like this.